A deep space surveillance station never went silent. It whispered through data streams, pulsed through sensor relays, and fed information into the vast neural web of Earth's defense grid. Yet tonight, something unexpected had entered the system. Commander Adrik Volkov sat motionless in the control bay of Erebus Station, orbiting beyond the moon. His gaze locked onto a series of flashing alerts crawling across the primary display. Unidentified contacts, appearing in deep space, not approaching from known hyperlanes, no recorded signatures, no communications, just there. A dull vibration coursed through the deck plating beneath his boots, thermal regulators adjusting for the station's artificial gravity. The usual predictability of space felt wrong tonight. He leaned forward, fingers brushing the console as he pulled the long-range feed into sharper focus. It wasn't a malfunction. Hundreds of objects hovered in perfect geometric formation far beyond Mars. Their metallic contours reflected nothing, absorbing all spectrographic readings like they weren't ships, but voids in the fabric of space itself. Volkov exhaled slowly. "Lieutenant Kessler," he called out, voice steady, "confirm this isn't a ghost signal." The younger officer stiffened at his console, recalibrating the sensors with rapid efficiency. His breath hitched, but his voice remained clipped. "Contacts are real, sir. Holding position. No thermal emissions, no comm chatter, no drive signatures. Just there." Volkov's grip on the console tightened. This wasn't a rogue fleet. It was something else. "Tell me they're drifting," Volkov said. Kessler hesitated. "Negative. They're in perfect formation." Volkov's pulse slowed. Space was vast, unpredictable. But nothing about this was chance. This was calculated, intentional. Time to closest approach? Unknown. They're not moving, just watching. Volkov glanced at the tactical feed. Hundreds of unidentified vessels, motionless, silent, a predator observing its prey before the strike. Across the control deck, technicians worked in disciplined silence, rerouting power to planetary defense networks. The dim glow of their screens cast hard lines across their faces. No one spoke out of turn. They didn't have to. Volkov reached for the secured line, inputting an authorization code only 3 men on Earth could use, a direct link to strategic command. "Sir," Kessler pressed, voice lower now, "should we wake the Planetary Council?" Volkov's jaw tightened. His gut said yes, but the weight of that decision wasn't his alone. He straightened, gaze locked onto the void-shrouded fleet beyond Mars. He could almost feel the weight of unseen eyes staring back at him. "Not yet," he murmured. "Let's find out what we're dealing with first." Because once the alarm was raised, there was no going back. Volkov's fingers hovered over the secured comms panel. The weight of the decision pressed against his ribcage, but his instincts demanded patience. The unidentified fleet remained fixed beyond Mars, silent and unyielding. It wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. A flicker from the primary display pulled his attention. The data stream surged, recalibrating as Erebus Station's deep space scanners locked onto the anomaly with enhanced resolution. The images returned, blurred outlines against the void, impossibly smooth, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. They weren't debris. They weren't natural. Kessler adjusted the frequency bands, lips thinning. Still no response to our passive pings. The station's air carried the faint metallic sharpness of recycled oxygen, a sterile contrast to the tension tightening the command deck. Sweat gathered at Volkov's collar, cooling too quickly in the station's artificial climate control. Behind him, the quiet shuffling of boots signaled the arrival of Lieutenant Marek. His uniform still bore the creases of a recent shift change, but his expression was sharp. "Commander, Planetary Defense requests an immediate risk assessment." Volkov didn't turn from the display. "Tell them the risk is unknown. No hostilities, no movement." His voice remained steady, but something about those ships, motionless yet undeniably deliberate, unsettled him. Marek hesitated. "Sir, they don't just appear like this." Volkov met his gaze. "No, they don't." A deep, systemic vibration rattled through Erebus Station. Not an impact, A power fluctuation. The lighting flickered, momentarily casting the room into near darkness before stabilizing. Several technicians exchanged uneasy glances. Kessler's hands danced over his console. "Commander, we just lost telemetry on 5 orbital satellites. He exhaled sharply. "They're gone. No debris field. Just gone." Volkov's pulse slowed, not destroyed, erased. "Any readings on how?" Kessler swallowed, recalibrating. "No signatures, no energy output, no known interference pattern." He hesitated before adding, "It's like they were never there." The station's ventilation system released a quiet hiss, a low reminder of the sterile, enclosed world they occupied. But outside, beyond the metal plating, beyond the vacuum, something watched. Volkov leaned closer to the main screen, eyes narrowing. The alien fleet was no longer still. A shift, a recalibration of formation. Not an advance, not an attack, an adjustment. His mind moved too fast to grasp a single thought. Every defensive strategy he'd studied, every war game scenario, every historical engagement, none of it applied. A controlled breath steadied him. "Kessler, cross-analyze ship configurations. Do they match any known fleet structures?" The lieutenant's jaw tightened as he ran the sequences. Seconds stretched. A sharp inhale. "No known match." "Sir, we're looking at something new." Volkov exhaled through his nose. His muscles locked as a single, unshakable realization settled in his chest. They weren't preparing for war. They were studying something, and the subject of that study was Earth. Volkov's breath measured itself as he absorbed the data sprawled across the central display. The alien formation had shifted, their movements precise, measured. It wasn't a maneuver. It was deliberate adjustment, a recalibration of intent, a predator tilting its head before the strike. The recycled air inside Erebus Station carried a sterile bite, an artificial crispness that never quite belonged to the lungs. It made everything feel thinner, stretched, like the walls themselves were pressing inward. The absence of sound, aside from the quiet clicks of interface panels, amplified the unease crawling through the command deck. Lieutenant Kessler's fingers moved in controlled bursts over his console, posture rigid with the weight of unfolding realization. "Commander," he began, voice tempered. "New development." Volkov didn't shift his gaze from the screen. "Show me." A fresh overlay painted the screen in lines of red and gold. The alien ships, once rigid in their perfect geometry, were subtly adjusting their alignment, shifting to compensate for planetary rotation. Not passive, not idle, tracking. Marek's voice cut through the stillness. "They're not just watching us, sir. They're studying our orbit, planetary tilt, atmospheric conditions." A sharp exhale. "It's a targeting solution." A muscle in Volkov's jaw tightened, but he didn't react beyond that. "No confirmed hostilities yet." Marek frowned. "Not yet." On screen, the fleet remained indifferent to human observation, yet precise in its movements. Volkov's mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. This was no scouting expedition, no diplomatic arrival. "Planetary defenses demanding recommendations," Kessler murmured. The glow of the interface reflected off his cheekbones, carving tension into his face. "How do we proceed?" Volkov's fingers tapped a slow, methodical rhythm against the panel edge. His voice remained even. "We don't react yet." Marek stiffened. "Sir, respectfully." "We don't react," Volkov repeated, sharper this time. "We prepare." A command was different from a response. Responses were reflexive, dictated by the situation. Commands shaped the outcome. Volkov straightened. "Initiate blackout protocol for all remaining satellites. No outbound signals, no active scans, passive monitoring only." Kessler hesitated. "That puts us blind, sir." "Better blind than broadcasting." The order set the deck into controlled motion. Commands relayed, systems adjusted. The station dimmed as unnecessary energy outputs were rerouted. The weight of space, vast and indifferent, pressed against them through reinforced steel. Outside, the alien fleet moved again, not toward Earth, not away. A calculated drift, like a blade turning to catch the light. Volkov exhaled slowly, gaze locked on the screen. They're testing us. Kessler glanced up. To see how we respond? Volkov's expression remained unreadable. To see if we're worth responding to. Volkov's breath remained steady, but his mind was moving too fast for comfort. The alien fleet had shifted again, each vessel drifting with eerie precision, matching Earth's orbit like an unseen force was guiding their movement. Not aggression, not retreat, positioning. The screens cast a dim, artificial glow over the command deck, the only source of warmth in a room otherwise steeped in sterile cold. A quiet unease settled over the crew, a tension that spread like static before a lightning strike. Every motion, every breath felt heavier. Kessler adjusted the sensor arrays, his fingers moving with tight efficiency, but Volkov could see it, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed. No one liked waiting for the unknown. They're still not transmitting anything, Kessler muttered, recalibrating the visual feed. No demands, no warnings, no acknowledgement. Doesn't mean they aren't communicating, Volkov said. We're just not on the right frequency to hear it. Marek shifted behind him, arms crossed. If they wanted to make contact, they would have. His jaw tensed. This is something else. Outside the reinforced panels of Erebus Station, the vastness of space stretched like a wound cut across reality, an emptiness too immense to comprehend. The alien ships hovered within it, their presence a distortion of natural order. A low beep broke the stillness. Kessler's breath hitched. Commander. His fingers skated across his console, urgency sharpening his tone. Multiple satellites just vanished. No interference pattern, no debris. It's like we're erased, Volkov finished. A ripple passed through the deck crew, silent but undeniable. It wasn't destruction. It was precision. He straightened, voice cold steel. Confirm status of planetary defense grids. Active but holding at pre-engagement levels, Marek said. No targeting lock. No auto-response triggers. Good. Keep it that way. Marek's brow furrowed. Sir, we're losing assets, and we don't even know if we fire first, Volkov interrupted. We commit to a war we don't understand. He turned to the main display, gaze steady. And if we hesitate too long, we may not get to choose at all. A fresh wave of tension coiled through the air, unseen but suffocating. Then the ships moved. Not a slow drift, not positioning. Advance. Kessler's breath hitched. They're accelerating. The data feed pulsed, velocity readings spiking. Hundreds of ships, silent and calculated, closing the distance with impossible coordination. Volkov's grip tightened on the console. His next words cut through the command deck like a blade. Trigger full planetary alert. No hesitation, no second guessing. Because whatever came next would decide everything. Erebus Station pulsed with urgency. Red warning strobes cast sharp angles across steel surfaces, turning the command deck into a tableau of flickering shadows and frozen expressions. The distant alien fleet, silent, unreadable, had made its move. Hundreds of vessels advancing as one, their approach impossibly measured. No haste, no erratic deviations. A force that had already decided the outcome. Volkov straightened, fingers bracing against the edge of his console. Every instinct in his body screamed that something was wrong. This wasn't a charge. It wasn't a prelude to battle. It was an inevitability unfolding in real time. Status on defense grid? His voice cut through the thick air. Marek didn't hesitate. Orbital batteries locked and tracking. Ground-based launch sites fully armed. His brow creased. They're in range now. We could fire. Kessler turned, uncertainty pressing into the lines of his face. Commander, if we fire first... Volkov silenced him with a look. We hold. Not until we understand. The deck vibrated with the shifting weight of tension. Nobody spoke, but Volkov could feel it. The sharp, unrelenting pressure of waiting. Beyond the reinforced glass, the alien vessels grew larger, detail creeping into focus. They lacked insignia, lacked anything resembling conventional ship designs. Their hulls bent light around them, an effect that made them seem almost two-dimensional against the stars. like shadows that had torn themselves free from the void. Then, the station's emergency comms flared to life. The transmission came through, not in static bursts, not in fragmented language, but in flawless, structured, Earth-standard dialect. "We are here to witness." Every screen on the command deck blinked black. A cold sensation slipped through Volkov's chest, something deeper than fear, something that gnawed at the edges of logic. The voice wasn't mechanical, nor was it distorted. It was steady, unnatural in its clarity. Marek's voice barely concealed the weight behind it. "Who the hell are we dealing with?" The screens flared back online, data scrolling too fast to parse. Kessler's hands flew across his interface, but his breath hitched. "Sir," he swallowed, "they're inside our systems." Volkov didn't need to be told twice. Erebus Station's firewalls were hardened against anything short of a direct cyber assault from planetary-grade AIs. Yet the feed kept shifting. Not disrupted, but rewritten. Another transmission. The same voice, patient, unwavering. "Your kind has reached its threshold." Volkov felt his pulse slow, an eerie calm settling over his mind. This wasn't a declaration of war. This was something worse. Observation, judgment. The alien fleet wasn't here to conquer. It was here to decide what came next. Volkov barely registered the sound of Kessler exhaling sharply beside him. The command deck had become unnervingly quiet, save for the rhythmic flicker of data feeds recalibrating themselves. The alien fleet had spoken, not with weapons, not with threats, but with something colder. Certainty. "Your kind has reached its threshold." The words settled like a weight pressing against the chest, not an ultimatum, not a warning, but a statement of fact. The deck lighting seemed dimmer now, though no one had touched the controls. A trick of the mind or something more? Kessler's hands hesitated above his console, as if touching the system would confirm something he didn't want to know. "Commander, they're writing over our firewalls in real time. No known code, no signatures, but—" his voice thinned. "They're not taking control. They're just looking." Volkov's gaze remained locked on the main screen. "Can you cut them out?" Kessler swallowed. "I don't even know where they are." Marek's stance shifted, his usual composure cracking beneath something quieter. "They're inside every layer of our defense network and still haven't fired a shot. That's not an attack. That's evaluation." A long pause. The silence pressed inward, thicker than before. Then, without transition, every monitor shifted to live orbital telemetry. The alien ships had stopped moving. The formation had locked into a precise equidistant pattern, encircling Earth. Not aggressive, not defensive, positioning itself with an exactness that was unsettling. "They're waiting," Volkov murmured. Kessler's fingers skimmed over his console. "For what?" Volkov didn't answer. He turned, locking eyes with Marek. "Activate deep space long-range scans. I want a full system sweep." Marek hesitated, but only for a second. "Acknowledged." Kessler tensed. "Sir, you think something else is out there?" Volkov didn't think. He knew. The way the alien fleet had arrived, the way they observed, the deliberate phrasing in their transmission. They weren't conquerors, weren't diplomats. They were sentinels. And if they were watching, it meant there was something worth watching for. Marek's display pulsed, deep space sensors pulling from every available relay still online. Volkov barely noticed how the recycled air carried the faintest static charge now, a metallic taste on the tongue, as if the very atmosphere inside the station was reacting to an unseen force. Marek's breath slowed. His fingers curled slightly against the edge of his station. Then the readings came in. His voice, when it finally surfaced, was quieter than it should have been. "Commander?" A pause, then sharper. "We have a second incoming fleet. Not the same signatures, not the same pattern, something else entirely. And it wasn't stopping." Volkov's pulse slowed, but his thoughts sharpened. A second fleet. The monitors filled with raw data, trajectory models, mass calculations, gravitational wakes, an entire formation materializing at the system's edge. Unlike the first fleet, These ships weren't holding position. They were moving fast. Marek's jaw clenched. Multiple vessels inbound, larger than the first fleet. No known signatures. He adjusted the feed, scanning thermal outputs. They aren't hiding their approach. They're coming in like they own the system. The command deck's atmosphere felt heavier, the artificial gravity pressing just a little more than usual. It was in their heads, the weight of understanding. Kessler's knuckles paled against the console. Do they match anything in our database? Marek shook his head, fingers gliding over the controls with measured precision. No correlations. This isn't one of ours, and it sure as hell isn't theirs. His gaze flicked to the main display, where the original alien fleet still held its formation around Earth. Unmoving. Watching. A sharp sensation crawled up Volkov's spine. The First Fleet had never acted like an invasion force. They had positioned themselves, observed, assessed. They weren't attackers. They were anticipating something. The realization hit like a cold knife. They knew, Volkov said under his breath. Then louder. They were waiting for this. Marek exhaled sharply. If that's true, why the hell didn't they warn us? Kessler's voice came tight. Maybe that's not their function. The thought settled like iron in the gut. If the First Fleet was here as witnesses, what was the Second Fleet here to do? Time to closest approach? Volkov asked, already bracing for the answer. Less than an hour before they're in orbit, Marek confirmed. They aren't slowing down. The monitors adjusted again. New readings. The Second Fleet wasn't just inbound, it was accelerating. Volkov turned to Kessler. Send immediate transmission to Strategic Command. Full system alert. Kessler nodded, already patching through encrypted channels. And the Watchers? Volkov hesitated. On the screen, the First Fleet remained still, their impossible geometry locked into place, unmoved by the growing storm. We wait, Volkov murmured. Let's see what side they're really on. The command deck seemed to breathe around them, the low thrum of power cycling through the reinforced plating. On screen, the Second Fleet closed the distance in calculated strides. It wouldn't be long now. The question wasn't whether war was coming. The question was who the real enemy was. Volkov's gaze locked onto the approaching fleet, its formation tightening as it entered the outer orbital grid. A force that was neither hesitant nor reckless, just inevitable. The air in the command deck felt sharper, charged, as if the station itself sensed the coming storm. Incoming fleet now within primary defense parameters, Marek reported, his voice stripped of anything but function. No deviation in trajectory, no response to hails. Kessler's fingers tightened on his console. They're not here to negotiate. Volkov didn't need to be told. The Second Fleet moved like a descending blade, a force that had already decided the outcome. He exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. Full tactical assessment. Marek's hands flicked over the interface. Weapon systems detected. Unknown configuration, but heat signatures suggest high-output energy artillery. Their hull compositions are absorbing scans. Size range, 60 to 80% larger than our largest warships. Fleet count? 312 vessels. A pause. That we can confirm. A cold sensation coiled at the base of Volkov's spine. He forced himself to ignore it. And the Watchers? Kessler's throat worked around the words. Still in position, no movement, no engagement. They weren't reacting at all. Marek frowned. They knew this was coming. Why aren't they responding? Volkov stared at the primary screen, at the eerily still formation of the Watchers' fleet. Silent, observing. They were waiting. A sharp beep cut through the tension. Kessler stiffened. New movement. Enemy fleet has begun combat positioning. They're deploying something. Large-scale structures detaching from their hulls. The monitors adjusted, showing newly separated entities drifting away from the main vessels. Not weapons, not drones. Structures. Marek's breath came slower. They're building something. Volkov's mind moved too fast to settle on a single thought. No species had ever deployed infrastructure mid-battle. Unless, Kessler's voice snapped through the deck, they're deploying planetary suppression grids. Volkov's heartbeat barely changed. Confirm. Marek's data stream locked onto the configurations. Confirmed. Surface targeting platforms, likely gravity-based disruptors. If those things activate, they won't just hit our orbital defenses. They'll interfere with Earth's atmospheric integrity. A planetary siege. Before the first shot was even fired, Volkov exhaled, slow and controlled. The game was over before it had even started. Unless he changed the rules. He straightened, his presence settling the tension in the room before he even spoke. Initiate countermeasures. We're not waiting for them to make the first move. Kessler's eyes flickered toward him. Sir, are we engaging? Volkov's gaze didn't leave the screen. We're not fighting for orbit anymore. His voice was steel. We're fighting for the ground. Earth was about to become a battlefield, and humanity's survival depended on where the first blow landed. Volkov watched the tactical feed shift in real time. The enemy fleet was locking the planet in a slow, deliberate chokehold. Their suppression grids settled into position, aligning with Earth's gravitational field like a cage being welded shut. Not a bombardment, not a massacre, a controlled dissection. Kessler's voice came clipped, sharp. Sir, they've begun atmospheric distortion, gravitational flux readings spiking across multiple sectors. His fingers moved quickly over his console. They're not just targeting orbit, they're altering pressure systems over major population centers. Volkov's jaw tightened. They're preparing to force us into surrender. Marek's grip on his display hardened, or something worse. The station's alert system pulsed, a steady warning beat that settled beneath the skin, merging with the racing of his pulse. Volkov had spent his life in battle simulations, war games, tactical analysis. But nothing about this was standard warfare. Kessler's breath shallowed. Commander, we need to act now. If those suppressors activate, Earth's surface defenses will collapse before we get a shot off. Volkov didn't hesitate. Coordinate with ground command. Full dispersal of planetary defenses. Every major stronghold needs to break formation. Scatter our forces before they lock us down. Kessler relayed the orders, his voice steadier than his expression. The station's displays shifted, Earth's defense forces fracturing into smaller, more elusive clusters. A necessary move. If they couldn't fight in formation, they'd fight in shadows. Marek's gaze stayed locked on the enemy fleet. They haven't opened fire. They don't need to. Volkov's fingers flexed against the steel edge of the console. They think they've already won. Then the Watchers moved. For the first time since their arrival, the fleet that had remained motionless, silent, detached, reacted. Volkov's breath stalled as the formation shifted, the once static fleet recalibrating in controlled synchrony. No weapons powered, no aggression, just movement. Kessler tensed. They're repositioning. Marek's brows furrowed. They're flanking Earth. Why? Volkov's mind worked through the possibilities. They hadn't interfered, hadn't declared their allegiance, hadn't lifted a finger against the enemy fleet. But now? Now they were adjusting their stance, aligning themselves along new coordinates. A flicker of understanding sparked at the edge of his thoughts. They weren't defending Earth. They were reinforcing their observation. His voice dropped. They want to see how we handle this. Marek exhaled. They're treating this as a test. The realization settled deep in his bones. The Watchers weren't allies. They weren't enemies. They were waiting to see if humanity could endure. Volkov's hands curled into fists. Then we give them a war worth watching. The station trembled as Earth's first counteroffensive launched. The battle for survival had begun. Volkov's eyes remained fixed on the tactical feed as Earth's counteroffensive roared to life. Orbital defense platforms detonated their first salvo. A calculated storm of kinetic lances and directed energy bursts slicing through the black. The missiles left ribbons of light in their wake, racing toward the enemy suppression grids. Direct impact! Kessler's voice cut through the command deck, charged with adrenaline. Outer grid destabilizing. 2 structures down. But the enemy fleet didn't scatter. It absorbed the blow, adjusted and retaliated. New signals flooded the station's screens. The enemy ships reconfigured their formation, recalibrating with unsettling precision. The gravitational suppressors that had been struck simply dissolved into metallic dust. their purpose already fulfilled. Marek swore. That was a test. They let us hit them. Volkov's fingers curled against the console. They wanted to see our strike patterns. Kessler's breath hitched. They're adapting. The next wave came faster than expected. The enemy fleet surged forward, their firepower finally unleashed. Pulses of energy lanced downward, colliding with Earth's atmosphere in calculated bursts. They weren't targeting military installations. They were striking fault lines. Volkov's stomach tightened. They're not attacking us. They're attacking the planet. Marek's hands flew over the controls. Seismic destabilization in progress. Magnitude readings climbing. His voice strained. They're trying to force tectonic collapse. A kill shot without a single direct casualty. Kessler's knuckles whitened. If they trigger a chain reaction, we lose entire continents. Volkov didn't allow his voice to waver. Then we move first. The station's lighting flickered as new command relays fed into the defense network. Earth's counterstrike intensified, missile platforms recalibrating their trajectories. Every projectile now aimed not at enemy ships, but at the gravitational suppressors still holding position. Redirect bombardment, Volkov's command cut through the tense air. Target every remaining suppression grid. From the planet below, Earth's forces responded in kind. Surface-based artillery launched payloads into the sky, rail cannons discharging magnetic slugs at blistering speeds. Orbital strike teams maneuvered, taking calculated risks to breach the enemy's front line. The first explosion rippled through the suppressor network. Marek let out a sharp breath. Chain reaction initiated. Their system is destabilizing. Grids are collapsing. But the victory was short-lived. The enemy adapted again. Commander! Kessler's voice carried an edge of disbelief. They're shifting their formation. Consolidating. They're abandoning suppression protocols. Volkov's pulse remained steady. They had forced the enemy's hand. Then they're coming in full force, he murmured. Marek exhaled. Ground invasion. Volkov's gaze hardened. We make them bleed for every inch. The enemy had finally committed to war, and Earth was ready to welcome them. Volkov's eyes remained fixed on the tactical feed as Earth's counteroffensive roared to life. Orbital defense platforms detonated their first salvo, a calculated storm of kinetic lances and directed energy bursts slicing through the black. The missiles left ribbons of light in their wake, racing toward the enemy suppression grids. Direct impact! Kessler's voice cut through the command deck, charged with adrenaline. Outer grid destabilizing, 2 structures down! But the enemy fleet didn't scatter. It absorbed the blow, adjusted, and retaliated. New signals flooded the station screens. The enemy ships reconfigured their formation, recalibrating with unsettling precision. The gravitational suppressors that had been struck simply dissolved into metallic dust, their purpose already fulfilled. Marek swore. That was a test. They let us hit them. Volkov's fingers curled against the console. They wanted to see our strike patterns. Kessler's breath hitched. They're adapting. The next wave came faster than expected. The enemy fleet surged forward, their firepower finally unleashed. Pulses of energy lanced downward, colliding with Earth's atmosphere in calculated bursts. They weren't targeting military installations. They were striking fault lines. Volkov's stomach tightened. They're not attacking us. They're attacking the planet. Marek's hands flew over the controls. Seismic destabilization in progress, magnitude readings climbing. His voice strained. They're trying to force tectonic collapse. A kill shot without a single direct casualty. Kessler's knuckles whitened. If they trigger a chain reaction, we lose entire continents. Volkov didn't allow his voice to waver. Then we move first. The station's lighting flickered as new command relays fed into the defense network. Earth's counterstrike intensified, missile platforms recalibrating their trajectories. Every projectile now aimed not at enemy ships, but at the gravitational suppressors still holding position. Redirect bombardment, Volkov's command cut through the tense air. Target every remaining suppression grid. From the planet below, Earth's forces responded in kind. Surface-based artillery launched payloads into the sky, rail cannons discharging magnetic slugs at blistering speeds. Orbital strike teams maneuvered, taking calculated risks to breach the enemy's front line. The first explosion rippled through the suppressor network. Marek let out a sharp breath. Chain reaction initiated. Their system is destabilizing. Grids are collapsing. But the victory was short-lived. The enemy adapted again. Commander! Kessler's voice carried an edge of disbelief. They're shifting their formation, consolidating. They're abandoning suppression protocols. Volkov's pulse remained steady. They had forced the enemy's hand. Then they're coming in full force, he murmured. Marek exhaled. Ground invasion. Volkov's gaze hardened. We make them bleed for every inch. The enemy had finally committed to war, and Earth was ready to welcome them. The ground trembled beneath the weight of war. Shockwaves rolled through the battlefield, rattling the remains of shattered infrastructure as fire streaked across the sky. What had once been a sprawling metropolis was now a labyrinth of debris and crumbling steel, a battleground where survival was measured in minutes. Volkov pushed forward, boots crunching over fractured concrete. Smoke curled through the ruined streets, thick with the bitter tang of scorched metal and pulverized stone. The distant roar of artillery filled the air, but it was the silence between the barrages that unsettled him the most. Kessler's voice crackled through his earpiece. Enemy forces shifting formations. Reinforcements pushing through the eastern corridor. A pause. They're using the wreckage as cover. Volkov's eyes narrowed as he scanned the makeshift battlefield. The enemy wasn't advancing in brute force anymore. They were adapting, learning. He exhaled, watching distant figures move with disturbing coordination, their armored forms slipping through smoke-drenched ruins like shadows given weight. Marek crouched beside him, rifle tucked against his shoulder. They're cutting us off. If they collapse that corridor, we lose access to the underground tunnels. Volkov's pulse remained steady. Then we don't let them. He turned, signaling the remaining squads. We shift the fight. If they want the ruins, we make them choke on them. The makeshift command post buzzed with controlled urgency. Scanners mapped out enemy positions, heat signatures flickering through layers of dust and destruction. A three-dimensional display projected the battlefield in shifting lines of red and blue, but Volkov didn't need the visuals to know the fight was tipping against them. Kessler's voice came sharper this time. Commander, new contacts, movement detected along the upper ridge. A beat of hesitation. Not enemy signatures. Volkov's breath slowed. He turned toward the distant skyline where jagged remnants of buildings cut against the ashen sky. And then, motion. Figures moved through the wreckage, their silhouettes stark against the fires below. Not enemy forces, not human reinforcements, the Watchers. Volkov's grip tightened around his rifle. For the first time since the invasion began, the Watchers had moved. Marek exhaled through his teeth. They've been silent this whole time, and now they show up? Volkov's mind turned over the possibilities, each conclusion as unwelcome as the next. Were they here to observe the end? Or had something shifted in their calculus? A sharp explosion cut through his thoughts, enemy artillery striking dangerously close. Kessler's voice pressed through the static. Commander, we need to move. Now. Volkov didn't break his gaze from the Watcher's position. Let them watch, he muttered. We're not done yet. The battle was far from over, but something had changed. And for the first time, it wasn't just humanity making a choice. Volkov pulled back behind the shattered remains of a collapsed overpass, his mind dissecting the battlefield with precision. The Watchers had positioned themselves along the ridge, their presence shifting the balance in ways he couldn't yet predict. But the enemy, the real threat, was still pressing forward, forcing humanity's defenses into a tightening chokehold. Kessler's voice crackled in his earpiece. We're boxed in. Enemy formations have locked the east and south corridors. If they breach the underground tunnels, we lose our fallback positions. Volkov exhaled, eyes tracing the debris-strewn streets. The skeletal remains of skyscrapers looming like grave markers. Every structure, every obstruction, had the potential to be a weapon, a trap, an obstacle. They had lost the luxury of overwhelming firepower. Now survival depended on strategy. How much of the subgrid is still intact? He asked. Marek crouched beside him, pulling up schematics on a portable hollow map. The underground tunnel network stretched beneath the city like a web of forgotten arteries, once used for utilities, now their last avenue of maneuverability. Main tunnels are compromised, Marek said, voice tight, but the old transit lines are still viable. We can move, but not in large numbers. Volkov nodded. We don't need to move everyone. We need them to think we have. He tapped into the squad comms, voice low but resolute. We split into 3 groups. Kessler, take your team through the transit tunnels. Silent movement, no engagements. Set up decoy heat signatures along the old industrial zone. Make it look like we're retreating west. Kessler's brows furrowed. And the real plan? Volkov's gaze flickered toward the crumbling skyscrapers still standing in the distance. Steel, concrete, and gravity, the oldest weapons of war. We bring the city down on top of them. Marek's lips parted slightly. Controlled collapses? That's a hell of a risk. Not if we set the charges right, Volkov countered. We plant them along the main advance corridors. Detonation timing needs to be staggered so they funnel into our kill zones. No random destruction. We shape the battlefield, force them where we want them. Marek's hesitation lasted only a breath before he nodded. We can make that work, but we'll need precise placements and enough time to get clear. We don't have time, Volkov said. We make it. Kessler relayed orders, his team already moving toward the tunnels. Marek coordinated demolition crews, placing charges at key structural weak points, setting the bones of the city to break only when they needed them to. Above, the watchers remained motionless, waiting, measuring. Volkov's fingers flexed against his rifle. Let them observe. Let them take their notes. When the dust settled, he would make sure humanity wasn't just another failed civilization in their records. Set the charges, he ordered. Then we spring the trap. Volkov crouched behind a crumbling section of the transit platform, the weight of his decision pressing against his spine. The charges were set, the battlefield sculpted to their advantage. Now it was a matter of timing. One wrong move, one mistimed detonation, and the city wouldn't just trap the enemy, it would bury them all. Marek's voice filtered through the comms, taut with focus. Charges primed. Structural integrity readings show a 90% collapse probability, if they move where we expect. Volkov's gaze flickered toward the tactical display on his wrist. The enemy was pressing inward, their movements deliberate. They weren't charging recklessly. They were testing resistance, calculating how much pressure would force humanity into full retreat. They had no idea they were already in the kill zone. Kessler's voice cut in. Decoy team is in position. We've drawn their scouts westward, but the main force hasn't committed yet. A pause. They're waiting for something. Volkov's muscles tightened. For confirmation. Marek glanced up. They suspect a trap. Then we let them believe they've found one. Volkov toggled the secondary detonator sequence, adjusting the triggers. We give them a target, something valuable enough to draw them in, but not critical enough to compromise the plan. Marek nodded. What's the bait? Volkov tapped into the grid controls, rerouting power to a cluster of still-standing industrial facilities. The flickering cityscape shifted as hollow projectors activated, simulating defensive heat signatures, false strongholds laced with electromagnetic interference. Kessler exhaled. You want them to think our last line is in those ruins? Volkov's expression didn't waver. They'll dedicate their forces to wiping it out. The enemy responded almost immediately. Scout formations pulled back, signaling to their main forces. The weight of their advance shifted toward the false stronghold, positioning themselves directly within the collapse radius. Marek's fingers twitched over his detonator. We have them. Not yet, Volkov murmured. The enemy's front line surged forward, armored behemoths weaving through the skeletal remains of the city, drawn in by the projected defenses. Their suppressor units followed close behind, reinforcing the illusion that this was the final stand. Volkov watched the formation unfold. They were committing everything. His thumb hovered over the primary detonator. A second too soon, and they might adjust. A second too late, and they might escape. The enemy reached the final threshold. Volkov pressed the trigger. The world fractured. A chain reaction rippled through the ruins, each detonation collapsing structures in rapid succession. Steel groaned, concrete shattered, the city itself turning into a weapon. Enemy units scrambled to reposition, but it was too late. Their own momentum crushed them beneath the debris. Kessler's voice came through, breathless. Direct hits across all targets. Enemy movement disrupted. Volkov didn't relax. Not enough. Marek wiped dust from his visor. They're buried. What more do we need? Volkov's eyes locked on the remaining fleet above. They're not beaten, he said. Not yet. Dust choked the air, turning the ruined city into a graveyard of twisted steel and fractured stone. The enemy had been buried beneath the very ground they sought to claim. The detonations had done their job, but Volkov knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Marek wiped grit from his face, eyes darting toward the tactical readout. No movement from the suppression units. Their front line is crushed. We did it. Volkov didn't answer. His gaze lifted to the sky. The fleet still hung there, watching, waiting. Kessler's voice came through, raw but steady. Why aren't they retreating? Volkov exhaled, his grip tightening around his rifle. Because they don't fear losing troops. They only fear losing control. The dust began to settle, revealing the wreckage of the enemy's advance. But then, the first shift. A tremor, small at first, barely a flicker on the scanners, then another. The rubble shifted. Metal screeched. Marek took a half-step back. Number there, emerging. Not soldiers. Not infantry. Something else. Something worse. The Watchers had known. That's why they hadn't moved. That's why they had watched so intently. This wasn't just a war. This was a measure of humanity's worth. From the depths of collapsed towers and crumbled streets, the enemy forced its way free. Their armor cracked, their formations broken, but their will undeterred. Kessler's voice cut through the rising dread. They're not stopping. Marek clenched his jaw. We don't have another trap left. Volkov's stare burned into the advancing forces. He had spent his life in war, studying it, mastering it. He knew what desperation looked like. And this? This wasn't desperation. This was certainty. They believed humanity would break. A deep breath filled his lungs. They think this is where we fall, he said, voice cold and final. So we show them what happens when they push us too far. Kessler's grip tightened on his weapon. We don't have the numbers for a full engagement. Volkov met his gaze. We don't need numbers. We need resolve. Marek shook his head. They'll keep coming. Then we keep fighting, Volkov said, stepping forward. The dust coiled around his boots. They want to witness humanity's darkest hour. His gaze cut toward the Watcher's fleet, still unmoving. Then let them witness this. Kessler's breath hitched. Sir, what are you... Volkov activated his comm, broadcasting across all surviving units. Every soldier, every pilot, every last man standing. This isn't a war we win with technology. It's not a war we win with numbers. It's a war we win by showing them what we are. His voice burned into the silence. They thought we would break. They thought we would fall. He leveled his weapon. They thought wrong. Volkov stepped forward, rifle raised, boots pressing into the shattered remains of the battlefield. The enemy thought they had seen humanity's limit. They had only seen the beginning. The battered remnants of Earth's defenders took position behind him, bloodied but unbroken, outnumbered but unwavering. Kessler wiped the grime from his face, his grip firm on his weapon. Marek, breathing hard, locked eyes with Volkov. Orders? Volkov exhaled, steady. We hold. The enemy advanced, a tide of metal and malice forcing its way through the wreckage, broken armor, cracked plating. They should have fallen with the city, but still they came. The Watchers remained silent, their fleet untouched, their judgment withheld. Not intervening, not stopping it, just watching. Volkov's pulse remained even. They want proof? His voice carried across the open comms. We give it to them. The first shot rang out, then another, then a storm. Earth's defenders unleashed hell. Explosions ripped through the advancing front, fire and shrapnel carving through enemy ranks. The ground quaked beneath them, but humanity didn't flinch. This was their land, their fight. Kessler shouted over the din. "They're pushing harder." "Let them," Volkov answered. "They think endurance is a weapon only they possess. We show them what it means to stand when everything else falls." The enemy closed the gap. Gunfire turned to melee. Blades clashed against reinforced plating, human hands breaking past alien armor. They had superior numbers. Humanity had something stronger. Purpose. Marek drove his weapon into an enemy's exposed core, twisting with brutal efficiency. Kessler took a strike to the shoulder, but stayed on his feet. No one backed down. No one hesitated. Then the sky burned. A ripple of light erupted above the battlefield. The Watcher's fleet shifted. For the first time, they moved. Volkov's breath slowed. The enemy, relentless moments before, faltered. Their advance hesitated. A voice, neither mechanical nor organic, resonated across all channels. A single declaration. Enough. Everything stopped. The enemy froze mid-charge. The battlefield stilled. The air itself felt heavier, charged with something neither fear nor power could explain. Volkov's fingers twitched near his trigger. "What now?" The lead watcher spoke. "We have seen." Volkov straightened, breath steady. And a pause, then an answer that would echo beyond this war. "You do not yield." The enemy forces began withdrawing, not in panic, in recognition. Their attack had not failed. Their understanding of humanity had. The Watcher's fleet pivoted, the vast, silent witnesses finally satisfied, not with victory, not with defeat, with knowledge. Volkov exhaled, lowering his weapon. Humanity had been measured, and they had been found worthy.